U.S. forces have captured Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, and transferred him into U.S. custody, triggering one of the most dramatic geopolitical crises of the modern era. The operation unfolded in the early hours when explosions and military activity were reported in and around Caracas. Residents described loud detonations, aircraft overhead, and sudden disruptions to communications. Within hours, it became clear that this was not a limited strike or a symbolic show of force, but a coordinated operation aimed directly at the country's leadership. Soon after, confirmation followed. A plane carrying Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, landed at Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York under heavy security, U.S. Officials stated that both were taken into custody and transferred to face criminal charges in federal court. The framing from Washington was immediate and deliberate. This, they said, was an arrest. Not a coup, not an invasion, a law enforcement action carried out on an international scale. That framing lasted only until the next statement. In a televised address, the U.S. president confirmed the capture and then announced that the United States would run Venezuela temporarily until a safe transition could be secured. He spoke openly about rebuilding the country's oil sector and inviting American companies to invest billions to restore production. In a single moment, the narrative shifted. What had been presented as a targeted operation to bring an indicted individual to justice now carried the language of political control. And that contradiction is at the heart of the crisis now unfolding. U.S. Officials described the operation as the result of months of planning, intelligence gathering, and coordination involving elite special operations forces. They emphasized that the goal was to dismantle criminal networks allegedly linked to the Venezuelan leadership and to prevent further harm to U.S. security interests. But critics immediately pointed out the legal tension. If this was purely law enforcement, why announce plans to administer the country? And if this was political intervention, on what legal basis was force used without international authorization? At home, the constitutional question surfaced just as quickly. Members of Congress from both parties asked whether the president had the authority to carry out a military operation of this scale without explicit congressional approval. No new authorization for the use of military force had been passed. The debate over executive power, war powers, and oversight erupted almost instantly. Internationally, the reaction was even sharper. Governments across Latin America and beyond condemned the operation as a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Brazil described it as crossing a dangerous line and warned of regional destabilization. Colombia rejected any form of aggression against a neighboring state, even while reiterating its opposition to drug trafficking and organized crime. Mexico, France, China, and others raised concerns about the precedent being set. Some leaders expressed support, framing the capture as accountability for an authoritarian regime. But even among sympathetic voices, there was visible unease about the method. At the United Nations, the focus shifted to legality. An emergency Security Council session was called as diplomats prepared to confront the core issue: whether a powerful state can use military force to seize a sitting head of state, transport them to a domestic court, and then claim an open-ended role in governing the country. Under the UN Charter, the use of force is permitted only in self-defense or with Security Council authorization. Legal experts emphasize that even serious criminal allegations do not automatically justify military intervention. The blending of prosecution and regime control, they warned, risks hollowing out the very rules meant to restrain global power. Inside Venezuela, the situation became murky and contested. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez appeared on state television insisting that Maduro remained the country's legitimate president and denouncing the operation as an act of aggression. She rejected claims that she had agreed to any transitional arrangement and accused the United States of fabricating cooperation to legitimize its actions. At the same time, U.S. officials suggested that elements within the Venezuelan government were cooperating behind the scenes to stabilize the situation. The contradiction fueled speculation about internal fractures, negotiations, and competing centers of authority. The opposition faced its own dilemma. Some opposition figures and diaspora communities celebrated the removal of a leader they viewed as responsible for years of repression, economic collapse, and mass migration. Others warned that change imposed from outside, no matter how justified it may seem, risks leaving institutions weakened and legitimacy contested. The fundamental question hung in the air. Does removing a leader remove the system that sustained them? Drug trafficking quickly emerged as the central justification offered by Washington. The administration repeatedly framed the operation as part of a broader fight against narcotics harming Americans. But analysts pointed to long-standing data showing that cocaine production is concentrated elsewhere in the region, with Venezuela more commonly described as a transit corridor rather than a primary source. That gap between rhetoric and statistics sharpened skepticism and redirected attention to strategic motives, particularly energy. Venezuela's oil loomed over everything. Despite years of collapse, mismanagement, sanctions, and underinvestment, the country still holds some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. When the U.S. president spoke about running Venezuela and reviving oil production in the same breath, critics warned that the optics resembled resource control rather than humanitarian stabilization. Supporters argued that outside management could restore transparency, create jobs, and fund social services. Opponents countered that such arrangements risk deepening perceptions of neocolonialism and undermining any claim of democratic intent. The ripple effects were immediate but quiet. Airspace restrictions and security measures disrupted flights across parts of the Caribbean, turning a geopolitical crisis into canceled plans and rerouted journeys. For many people far from Caracas or Washington, this was their first tangible encounter with the situation. A delay notification, a missed connection, a reminder that distant decisions have personal consequences. Humanitarian organizations warned that further instability could disrupt supply chains, complicate aid delivery, and worsen conditions for vulnerable communities inside Venezuela and along its borders. They called for de-escalation, humanitarian corridors, and clarity about timelines. Meanwhile, another major power moved into view. Russia condemned the operation and emphasized principles of sovereignty and international law. Officials framed the action as a dangerous violation of global norms and signaled diplomatic resistance. Analysts immediately asked how far that resistance could go and whether the crisis could evolve into a broader great power confrontation. The deeper concern was not immediate retaliation, but precedent. If one state can justify detaining a foreign leader, redefining them as a criminal, and assuming temporary control, what stops others from doing the same? Who decides when law overrides sovereignty, and who enforces that decision? Inside the United States, the debate hardened. Supporters praised the operation as decisive action after years of sanctions and diplomacy failed to produce change. Critics warned that wrapping military intervention in prosecutorial language risks eroding both constitutional checks and international trust. Editorials questioned whether running another country, even temporarily, can coexist with claims of rule of law. Town halls filled with practical questions. How long will troops stay? How much will this cost? And what does success actually look like? In courtrooms, the stakes were just as high. Federal judges now face decisions that carry global implications. Jurisdiction, head of state, immunity, due process, and the legitimacy of evidence obtained through military action will all be scrutinized. Human rights organizations stress that any perception of a politicized or rushed trial could damage confidence in justice far beyond this single case. At the center of all this are people with the least control. Ordinary Venezuelans, already shaped by years of economic hardship and political polarization, reacted with a mix of cautious hope and deep fear. Some saw a chance for change. Others feared chaos, retaliation, and uncertainty imposed from outside. They asked simple questions that no press conference could answer. Will electricity remain stable? Will food and medicine be available? Will borders close? Will violence increase? Will daily life become more predictable or less? When you step back, this moment is bigger than one leader, one operation, or one speech. It is a stress test of the international system itself. It forces governments to confront where the line lies between justice and power, between accountability and sovereignty. It challenges the assumption that rules apply evenly, and asks what happens when enforcement is selective and backed by overwhelming force. This is not just a crisis about Venezuela. It is about what becomes acceptable in a world where military capability, legal language, and political goals are increasingly intertwined. Because once a boundary is crossed, it does not reset automatically. Others watch, others learn, others adapt. The decisions made now at the UN, in US courts, in Caracas, and in foreign capitals will echo far beyond this moment. They will shape how future leaders calculate risk, justify action, and interpret law. For the global public, the lesson is not to accept any single narrative at face value. It is to ask harder questions. What evidence is being used? What alternatives were rejected? Whose voices are missing? And who benefits from the outcome? The first headlines rarely tell the full story. They are only the opening frame.